A trauma psychologist would read this as the exact second emotional erasure becomes awakening. Elara has spent years being told she is paranoid, too sensitive, too far outside her husband's world to understand the pressure he carries. Then, one hidden folder reveals the truth. The loneliness was engineered, the replacement was planned, and her marriage was being dismantled in boardroom language. This is not just betrayal, it is the birth of clarity, Dine.
Amelia stood at the center of the Metropolitan Museum's Grand Hall during the Davenport Capital Annual Charity Gala, a hand resting protectively over the curve of her stomach. A silent promise was being made to her unborn daughter. Across the room, 200 of New York's financial titans were celebrating her husband, but they only saw the flawless image he projected. Her husband, Arthur Davenport, the hedge fund genius who could make markets tremble, was holding court with a group of senators. At his side was Genevieve Croft, his brilliant and hungry junior partner, a woman whose ambition was as sharp as her stilettos. They didn't look like a mentor and protege, they looked like a power couple. Earlier, Arthur had dismissed her concerns about Genevieve's constant presence. "You're being hormonal, darling," he'd murmured. "I need you to go to my study and find the donor file for the senator." But inside the file, tucked behind the official documents, she found something else. It was a preliminary draft for a trust titled the Croft Legacy Fund. It wasn't a client account. It was a massive vehicle designed to shield personal assets with a detailed prospectus that felt chillingly intimate. And on the bottom, a sticky note in Arthur's hand. "G, our future, secured." The orchestra music faded to a dull drone. Her marriage, her home, her baby, they were all just liabilities in a hostile restructuring of her life. In 2 days, alone in their cavernous Park Avenue apartment, she would learn the full terms of his buyout, a betrayal so meticulously planned it was designed to liquidate her entire world. This was more than just infidelity. It was a corporate coup against her. The trust prospectus was just the opening salvo. Back in their apartment, feigning a headache, she unlocked his private computer. There were no incriminating texts, but there was a hidden folder containing encrypted financial statements. Trips to Geneva and the Cayman Islands, disguised as international fund exploration, were actually for setting up offshore accounts for Arthur and Genevieve. A $500,000 payment to a private art dealer was coded as a portfolio diversification, but she knew it was for the painting Genevieve had coveted at a Sotheby's auction. This wasn't a sordid affair, it was a succession plan. Genevieve wasn't just his lover, she was his designated successor, and Amelia, 8 months pregnant, was the final liability to be written off. But this isn't a story about a broken heart. It's about what Amelia did next. When the man who saw her as a decorative, philanthropic wife realized his fatal miscalculation. It's the story of how she used her intimate knowledge of the firm's donors, their vanities, their secrets, their pressure points, to dismantle a financial empire from the inside out. It's about how a titan's grand strategy, designed to secure his new legacy, became the very instrument of ruin for everyone who thought she was just part of the portfolio. For 3 days, a dense, wet fog had rolled in off the Atlantic, cloaking the city in a gray shroud, as if Manhattan itself could feel the storm brewing inside the glass towers of Wall Street. The hedge fund managers in their custom suits, the politicians who enjoyed Arthur's donations, the society bloggers who chronicled their every move. They all consumed the perfect narrative. Arthur Davenport, the ruthless market king, and his beautiful wife Amelia, the firm's compassionate soul. They never noticed how Arthur's private line buzzed with Genevieve's calls at all hours, or how he began to critique Amelia's charity choices with a trader's brutal logic. They didn't see Genevieve, who had joined the firm 3 years ago and systematically engineered a place for herself in the core of their life. Amelia had tried to befriend her. Genevieve was whip smart, impeccably dressed, and always ready with a compliment that now felt like a hostile valuation. "Arthur is on another level," she'd say. "It must be difficult for you, focusing on the softer assets." Alone in the now empty ballroom, Amelia whispered to her baby, a quiet vow. "I am so sorry I didn't listen to my gut. I'm sorry I let him convince me I was just being emotional." The donor file in her hands felt impossibly dense, weighted not by paper, but by years of perfectly executed fraud. She replayed every time Arthur had explained away her instincts. His late nights with Genevieve were war rooming a hostile takeover. Their frequent trips together were essential to calming international markets. Her creeping feeling of being erased was her inability to handle the stress of his world. He had gaslighted her into thinking her intuition was a liability. She watched Genevieve's aggressive, high-risk trading style become the firm's celebrated new direction. She watched them forge a universe of shared victories and knowing glances that became an impenetrable fortress, leaving Amelia outside. She was the inconvenient variable in their perfect financial forecast, a rounding error to be deleted. No one stepped in their glittering social strata. You didn't question the man who signed the checks. So Amelia stood taller. The persistent ache in her lower back, a physical reminder of the life she was now fighting for. She walked past the champagne bar, past the portraits of the firm's founders, past every monument to the dynasty he had built, a dynasty he was now transferring to another woman. She didn't make a sound. She didn't crack. She walked out of the museum and into the sharp New York air, no longer a betrayed wife, but a competing firm planning a devastating leveraged buyout. She took a car not to their apartment, but to her own private haven, a quiet office in a historical archive she chaired downtown. The scent of old books and preserved paper was an anchor, a world away from the cold glass and steel of the financial district. There, under the glow of a desk lamp, she began to work. Not with fury, but with the cold, focused strategy of a CEO preparing for war. She used the password she'd found in his notes, the one labeled contingency, and accessed a secure cloud server. It wasn't just a shock, it was a forensic audit of her own destruction. The pain was in the details, a draft of a press release announcing their amicable separation, citing her need to focus on her health. A file full of surveillance reports from a private investigator who had been following her for months. He wasn't just leaving her, he was building a legal and public relations case against her brick by meticulous brick. "You should never document a conspiracy, Arthur," she whispered into the silent, empty room. Her voice was steady, like a prosecutor outlining her closing argument. "Most men just cheat. You created an evidence trail." Most people weren't paying attention, but Amelia was. She returned to her desk and pulled out a large diagram, not for a project, but to map out her counteroffensive. The heavy engagement ring on her finger, the one Arthur had presented to her when Davenport Capital was just a bold idea discussed over dinner, felt like a cold piece of metal. The blood pounding in her ears was the only sound in the office. 200 of the city's most influential people had praised her husband's genius, and not one of them noticed the hostile takeover happening at his side. Not one curious look, not one whispered question, nothing. Genevieve stood next to him, poised and triumphant, her hand metaphorically on the plunger of a detonator. Amelia recalled Genevieve's argument at a recent partners meeting she had attended. "Our first duty is to cut any portfolio holdings that are dragging down performance." Amelia finally realized that she was the non-performing asset about to be cut. She cradled her belly, her promise to her daughter now hardening into a strategy devoid of tears or rage. He wanted a partner to build a dynasty, she thought. He just chose the wrong woman to liquidate. No one defended her because no one saw a battle. They saw a radiant, pregnant wife supporting her brilliant husband. Every last one of them had bought into the beautiful lie. Amelia didn't know it yet, but her silent declaration of war was already underway, launched by the very evidence they had so carelessly compiled. And that evidence, like a fatal flaw in their code, was about to crash the entire system. For 2 years, it was just them against the world. He was the man before the magazine covers, the one who ate deep dish pizza with her on the floor of their tiny apartment and mapped out his dreams on pizza boxes. That man brought her coffee every morning. He would listen for hours while she talked about the tension in a Rodin sculpture. He was present. He didn't know how to articulate his own fears, but he held her hand and he kept drawing. Then the money came. It swept into their lives like a tidal wave of private equity and fawning profiles. And with the money came Katya. She was 44, a legend, poached from a New York firm, renowned for her brutalist style and even more brutal business sense. She got Leo's jokes about structural engineering. She streamlined his pitches. She secured the billion-dollar deal that had always been out of reach. They hired her 6 months after Apex broke ground on its first tower. Clara had championed the decision. She told him he deserved the best. She smiled for the cameras because he asked her to, and because his happiness was hers, even as a warning bell chimed deep inside her. A feeling like a hairline fracture in a weight-bearing wall. The changes were incremental, so subtle that Clara never recognized them as a coordinated campaign. First, their Sunday gallery visits disappeared. Leo claimed the new financing round demanded his undivided attention, and Katya was the only one who could navigate those waters. What Maya didn't grasp then was that Ava wasn't just monopolizing his schedule. She was rewriting their history. Every time Maya voiced a concern about their growing distance, Ava would later tell Ethan it was Maya's anxiety about the IPO. Every creative idea Maya offered for the company's campus design was filtered through Ava and presented to Ethan as impractical. Her attempts to find the man she loved were met with a firewall of board meetings and investor calls. Ava had swapped their private life for profit margins, and Maya felt like she was being systematically deprecated. Her husband stopped asking about her blueprints. He stopped seeing her at all. She had no idea he was being told that she was resentful of his success and intimidated by Ava's drive. She was unaware that her marriage was the subject of a quiet, hostile takeover. Every night, Ethan would ask Maya about the baby's room, and her answer was always the same. "It's almost there, honey. It just needs your final opinion." You know I can't decide on the final colors. But to his COO, Ava, Ethan painted a completely different picture. "She's so focused on the nursery, my love. She's in her own little world. We have all the freedom we need." He'd say it was a blessing, a way to keep things simple. Then, he'd add, with a chilling thrill, "We wouldn't want to cause any undue stress before the baby arrives." Maya had stopped wondering what time he'd be home, given up on listening for his Tesla in the garage, and no longer expected to feel his hand on her stomach while she slept. She was becoming a beautiful, silent feature in their glass-walled Seattle penthouse, a ghost in the stark, minimalist rooms that once felt like a shared dream, now filled only with the faint hum of distant traffic. She was 7 months pregnant when she found it. A charge notification from their joint account. It wasn't for one of their usual expenses. 2 simple words: a bespoke jeweler downtown. She'd given up her thriving architectural practice, her wonderfully messy studio in Pioneer Square with its brick walls and sketches pinned everywhere. She had exchanged that vibrant life for sterile perfection in a skyscraper overlooking Puget Sound. She kept one framed photo on her nightstand from a backpacking trip in Thailand long before the venture capital, when he looked at her as if she were the only thing that mattered, both of them grinning, drenched in monsoon rain. She hadn't felt that man's presence in 2 years when the email arrived. The design proof lit up her laptop screen at 2:45 in the morning. An invoice for a custom necklace she'd never seen. Ava's initials were in the file name. A photo of a one-of-a-kind sapphire pendant, marked as paid in full. The note from the jeweler read, "For Ava to celebrate your big win. With all my love, E." Maya sat in the glow of the screen, the city lights below blurring into streaks. She didn't cry. She couldn't. A cold, dense certainty was forming in her gut. A weight that had been building for months. To cry would be to admit that the woman who believed in partnership and promises was a fool. He wasn't coming back to her. Not the man she married. And now she knew why. The annual Tech Innovators Gala was in 2 days. It wasn't for charity. It was for optics. Ethan Vance, the CEO of Omnicore, never wasted a chance to be seen. He always said that perception builds legacy, that you make people believe what you want them to. The heavy, embossed invitation sat on her dresser, an address for a glass and steel museum downtown, a start time, and a single printed line, "Your presence is my foundation." The main hall of the Museum of Modern Technology was a sea of sleek black suits and avant-garde dresses, smelling of expensive cologne and the quiet hum of ambition. Ava showed up 20 minutes early, a habit of hers. Power began with claiming your space, finding the best sightlines, and forcing the room to orbit you. She wore a dress of liquid silver because she wasn't mourning the end of anything, she was celebrating a new beginning. Her date was a junior programmer, talkative and harmless, the perfect camouflage. Ava was poised for this evening to be her public anointment. Maya arrived exactly on time, dressed in a simple, deep emerald gown that showcased the curve of her pregnancy. She had managed to conceal the swelling around her eyes from the tears that had finally briefly fallen. The sharp pain in her soul had subsided to a steady, heavy ache. She hadn't bothered with much jewelry. She located her designated table near the stage, rested her hands on her belly, and didn't scan the crowd for Ethan. She didn't look for anyone. Her gaze landed on the enormous, laser-etched crystal sculpture of their company's logo. It was flawless and cold, slowly distorting under the heat of the spotlights. She remembered Ethan whispering to her once years ago on a ferry to Bainbridge Island. True integrity is what you build when no one is watching. He used to believe things like that back when he coded free websites for local artists and tutored kids in his spare time. Because it's the right way to build, Maya, and that's the only thing that lasts. The room was buzzing. The chief financial officer of Omnicore gave her a respectful nod. Two investors whispered as they glanced at her baby bump. Ava let out a sharp, curated laugh at something her date said, and then the main door slid open and her entire world fractured. Ethan made his entrance. He was not by himself. Ava, her silver dress catching the light like a flare, was on his arm. Not as his COO, not as a guest. He was holding her hand. He moved with the smooth, frictionless confidence of a man who had never been told no, a man who designed his world to his exact specifications. He wore a custom-tailored suit that fit like a second skin, but his smile was generic, designed for the cameras. His sharp, analytical eyes swept the room, not for her, but for the press. The low hum of conversation in their path simply ceased. He leaned down and placed a soft kiss on Ava's temple, right there for the entire Seattle tech scene to see. And only then did he spot Maya. He looked at his 7 months pregnant wife, and his expression was a flicker of pure annoyance, like finding a bug in his otherwise perfect code. "My apologies for the delayed announcement, everyone," he projected into the conference room, his voice the same confident, resonant baritone that had secured billions in development deals. "My chief architect, Simone Dubois, and I were just finalizing the acquisition." He flashed a winning smile. "Now let's celebrate." Simone's smirk was a razor blade. Her gaze found Clara's across the crowded reception, a silent, vicious declaration of victory. 6 months ago, Julian Croft had started working late, his suit smelling of a jasmine perfume she never wore. He'd blamed it on the stress of a new skyscraper project. He claimed that empires weren't built by the most talented, but by those with absolute conviction. "Commitment," he had said, gesturing towards her pregnant belly, "is tested in the trenches. This is just a pressure test before our real legacy begins." He had poured himself a glass of vintage Bordeaux. He told her that a person's true foundation is exposed when the blueprints are challenged, when the right move is the hardest one. He had looked at Clara then, but his eyes were seeing a different skyline. She looked back at him now, standing across the polished boardroom, and something inside her didn't just crack, it disintegrated. It was the feeling of being designed, built, and then demolished. At the head of the table, Simone's hand was now draped possessively over Julian's. There were 67 people in that room, all witnessing the quiet, corporate assassination of a marriage. One person stood up, one person left her seat, her sparkling water forgotten, and walked past every investor and city planner, all of whom were now murmuring with a sudden, intense focus. She walked directly to the front of the room, picked up the presentation clicker, and began the most important pitch of her life. Her voice was utterly composed. "He's correct," she said, her eyes scanning the powerful faces, ignoring Julian. "A person's true foundation is exposed under pressure, and my husband," she paused, letting the silence magnify the impact, "has just experienced a catastrophic structural failure." She finally turned to Julian, whose face had become a rigid mask of disbelief. "And you," she said, looking directly at Simone, "can have the new development, but you will never own the brand." Clara's breathing was steady. Her hand came to rest on her belly. She twisted the heavy Cartier wedding band from her finger and placed it carefully on the glossy table. "This is the final dissolution of the Croft Partnership assets," she stated, her voice echoing with authority. "Effective immediately, with over 60 of our most important associates as witnesses." She retrieved the ring. The first acquisition in her new portfolio was not property. It was a declaration of self-worth. "If you are hearing this, it means I set my own valuation when it would have been simpler to accept a hostile takeover. That valuation belongs to me and to my child. We are retaining 100% equity in our future." A wave of sharp, collective intakes of breath filled the penthouse office. Not shock, but the sound of San Francisco's real estate royalty watching a dynasty implode. Simone went white. Julian's partner, David, looked like he was about to be physically ill in an orchid planter. Members of the board were already furtively texting on their phones. Clara stared at Julian, whose hands were clenched into tight fists, his expression a storm of fury. Her voice was a low whisper meant only for him. "I don't understand. You barely look at me these days." Julian's face contorted into a sneer. "I looked at her every single day," he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. "She understands ambition, and she has spent the last year of our marriage providing the creative fire you lost long ago." Simone's voice, sharp and trembling, sliced through the air between them. "This is outrageous! This is a personal matter! Our attorneys will deal with this slander." Clara didn't even acknowledge her. Her eyes were fixed on Julian. "Your legal team can draft whatever they want, Julian. But you ought to know I've been planning my own portfolio. I've been planning for everything." The celebration devolved into a chaos of urgent whispers. Clara walked out, her posture perfect. David made 3 panicked calls before he even reached the elevator. Julian and Simone were instantly surrounded by concerned partners. Clara sat in a taxi for 20 minutes, one hand on her belly, watching the fog roll in over the bay. The driver waited without a word. When Clara finally gave him the address of the small apartment she'd secretly kept in North Beach, just in case, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't experienced in years: agency. She didn't sleep. She sat in a worn armchair, the distant sound of the cable cars a forgotten melody, a cup of herbal tea cooling in her hands. She wasn't looking over floor plans. She was reviewing an old auction catalog filled with the art she had discovered for a life she was finally ready to curate for herself. It was a complex web of joint trusts and shared properties. A financial fortress designed to keep her trapped. Her phone buzzed nonstop with calls from blocked numbers and emails from investors who had treated her like a pretty ornament for a decade. She silenced it and called Lena. "So," Lena's voice came through without a hint of surprise, "you're officially on the market." "I suppose I am," Clara replied, the words feeling foreign. "I'm not sure I understand the terms of the deal yet." "It works like this. You're letting me take you to brunch tomorrow. I want that Dungeness crab omelet from Zazie, with extra avocado, and 2 of those morning buns from Tartine." Clara almost smiled. Almost. "Lena, I'm terrified." A moment of silence, then Lena's voice softened. "I know, honey, but you are the most valuable asset you own. You have me, and you have that little one inside you who is about to be born to the most formidable woman in the Bay Area. I haven't told anyone about the baby, I know, but you will when the time is right." Clara placed a hand on her stomach. The baby kicked, a firm nudge like a cornerstone being set. The very next day, the systematic demolition of her professional life began. Clara returned from a gallery meeting to find an email with a subject line that turned her blood to ice. Termination of curatorial contract. The Hayes Valley Gallery project, her biggest client, was being put on indefinite hold. 48 hours to vacate her office. No reason was given, no severance was offered. The gallery's main benefactor was a holding company named Golden Gate Ventures. Clara didn't need to guess who sat on its board. She collapsed onto her couch, rereading the message until the words swam. 7 months pregnant, with just over $900 in her personal account, and her career in ruins. The next morning, she got a call from her contact at the museum, where she was curating a new exhibit on California modernists. The call came from Marco, her business manager, his voice tight with an apology he clearly didn't want to make. "Elena, I'm so sorry. Our primary investor just pulled out. They're citing a strategic portfolio realignment. Your restaurant is being indefinitely postponed. Elena felt the air leave her lungs. My restaurant? The grand opening is in 6 weeks. Marco couldn't offer any more details. I'm truly sorry. She ended the call in a fog, a sick feeling coiling in her stomach. Driven by a dark instinct, she went to a tech news site she knew her husband read. A brand new article was at the top of the page, announcing a $200 million venture capital fund for lifestyle tech startups. The featured prodigy set to lead their first major project was a woman named Chloe Sterling. The fund, bankrolled by Julian Croft's firm, had been finalized 3 days before her investor vanished. Her life's dream evaporated. 5 months pregnant. In under 48 hours, Julian and his mistress had poisoned the dream she had nurtured for years. But they weren't done. That night, a key turned in the lock of their sprawling Seattle condo. She thought it was her friend Isabella, but it was Julian Croft, holding a ridiculously expensive bottle of vintage wine and wearing a mask of practiced concern. Julian. The man she'd loved for 5 years. The man she had called late one night, her voice trembling with happiness, to tell him she was pregnant. The man who had looked at her across their marble kitchen island, his eyes cold and distant, and said, "This isn't on the roadmap, Elena. This isn't part of my 5-year plan." He moved into the guest suite that night. No more late-night talks, no more gentle touches. He wasn't there for the first ultrasound, when she had to grip the crinkling paper on the exam table to keep from shaking as the technician pointed out the tiny, flickering pulse of a heartbeat. And now here he was, smelling of money and ambition, with that carefully constructed smile. "Elena," he said, stepping into the foyer, "I heard about the investor, about the restaurant. I am so sorry." "What do you want, Julian?" "I made a mistake, a terrible one. I was under a lot of pressure." The funding round, the baby, it was a lapse in judgment. But I've had time to think, and I want to be here. For you. For our child. Elena studied his face, really studied it, and saw the subtle mechanics of the deception. The split-second pause before he said "mistake," as his mind selected the most strategic word. He had no idea how terrified she was, or how close she was to financial ruin. He only knew he was about to lose control of the story. "Marcus?" she whispered, her voice brittle. "You said a baby wasn't in your 5-year plan. You missed every ultrasound, every single one. You treated me like a ghost in my own apartment. And now you're here with a reservation at Alinea because you're scared about your image. Izzy, that's not fair. The door is over there." He reached for her, his chef's hands that were usually so creative now feeling like a cage. She flinched back as if burned. He started to protest, but she slammed the oak door shut, shot the deadbolt home, and leaned against the wood, listening to his expensive shoes fade down the hallway. Only then did she collapse onto the cold marble floor. By 3 a.m, Isabel was huddled on her bathroom floor, clutching a towel, her body racked with sobs so deep they felt like they were ripping her in two. She'd given up her own culinary column to build his brand. The man who was supposed to be the father of her child was a calculating fraud. Her life, once a vibrant, perfectly plated dish, was now just ashes. Over $1 million was tied up in investment accounts that required his signature. She flattened a hand against her stomach, her voice a raw scrape. "I don't know how we're going to get through this." The baby kicked, a hard, defiant jab against her palm, as if to say, "I'm here. We're going to fight." Chloe's offensive was immediate. Not even a week later, a process server delivered a lawsuit to her door. They were suing her for defamation and tortious interference, having hired Julian Vance, a corporate shark notorious for dismantling careers. Isabel's own entertainment lawyer dropped her in a voicemail that lasted less than 30 seconds. The lawsuit was crafted from 3 audacious lies. First, that Isabel, in her jealousy, had accessed Marcus's private business emails. Second, that she had deliberately leaked details of a confidential restaurant expansion deal to a rival hospitality group. And third, the most poisonous barb, that she had fabricated emotional distress from her pregnancy to garner sympathy and extort a larger settlement. The preliminary hearing was set before Judge Alani Ramirez, 58 years old with 2 decades on the bench. She was known for her photographic memory and zero tolerance for courtroom antics. She once sanctioned a celebrity attorney $100,000 for citing a reality television show as a precedent. She was precisely the kind of judge Marcus should have dreaded. The gallery was filled, not with press, but with the titans of Chicago's restaurant scene. It was the juiciest scandal to hit the industry in years, and everyone was there for the spectacle. Isabel sat with her new lawyer, a woman her friend had found, wearing a simple gray dress that was professional but gave room for the gentle swell of her pregnancy. Her hands were folded on the table, betraying none of the terror that was making her want to bolt. Chloe was on the other side of the courtroom in a tailored ivory suit, her expression a perfect mask of betrayed innocence. Vance sat beside her, exuding a calm, predatory energy. A man who knew you destroyed lives with 1,000 paper cuts, not a single blow. He presented his case with chilling clarity, depicting Isabel as an unstable, resentful spouse who, threatened by her husband's bond with his brilliant young protege, decided to burn his empire to the ground. He referenced her dormant career, her modest social media following, her lack of formal culinary training. He made it all sound so terribly convincing, which was the truly terrifying part. Then he called his first witness. Isabel heard the name, but her brain couldn't quite process it. The plaintiff calls Chloe Sterling. A wave of ice water washed through her. Chloe glided to the witness stand in an outfit that cost more than Isabel's car. She was sworn in. She sat, and she pointedly refused to look at Isabel. Vance's questions were like scalpels. "Mr. Croft, how long were you and Miss Vance in a relationship?" "For 2 years." "During that time, did she ever speak about her estranged father's fortune?" "All the time. It was an obsession. She constantly talked about how she was entitled to a massive piece of the company. She called it her birthright." Ilara felt the air leave her lungs, her mouth hanging slightly open. Did she ever describe a plan to get back in her father's good graces? She said she was waiting for the right moment. The plan was to work her way back into the family before his health failed. She called the inheritance her golden parachute. Every word was a poisoned dart. Ilara had never, not once, discussed money with Julian. She barely ever mentioned her father, the pain being a private, closely guarded wound. Julian knew that. He had held her while she cried about it. He had asked about the single faded photograph on her bedside table, and she had explained that looking at more than one was too much for her heart to bear. Now, under oath, he was twisting every sacred, vulnerable moment they had shared into a weapon to destroy her. Vance was moving in for the kill. "Miss Sterling, in your observation, was Mrs. Thorne's pregnancy used as a tool for manipulation?" It was a calculated move. She saw it all now. Chloe had told him she wanted to build a dynasty, spinning a narrative of a legacy he could create with a partner who truly understood his genius. The idea must have been intoxicating. The grand ballroom of the Peninsula Hotel was buzzing with the city's culinary elite, but for Isabel, the sound had collapsed into a high-pitched whine. She could see the narrative taking shape, the secret alliance between her husband Marcus and his sommelier Chloe. Encrypted texts on Signal, quiet promises made in the wine cellar of his flagship restaurant. Her deepest hopes for their family, for their baby, had been nothing more than material for him to share with another woman. She wanted to shatter the wine glass in her hand, to climb on the table and scream that Marcus Thorne was a liar and a coward. She wanted to shout that the only calculation in her pregnancy was the fierce, animal love she already felt for the child inside her. But her friend Nina's hand found her arm, a gentle pressure that said asterisk not here, not now asterisk. The presenter called Marcus to the stage to accept his award. Isabel made it to the marble-clad restroom just as the first sob tore through her. She braced herself against the cold sink, stuffing her fist in her mouth to muffle the sound. Her body trembled, and the baby gave a sudden, sharp kick, as if it felt its mother's agony and wanted to lash out at the source. Nina found her like that. She didn't offer platitudes. She just slid down to the floor beside her, her own designer gown pooling around her, a silent, solid presence. She waited until Isabel's ragged breaths began to even out. "He's a complete fraud," Nina said, her voice a low growl. "And anyone in that room who isn't blinded by his Michelin stars can see it. He knows all my secrets, Neen, Isabel choked out. Every insecurity I ever told him. He knows the old Isabel, Nina corrected, turning to face her. The one who edited his cookbooks instead of writing her own story. It's time for him to meet this one. When they returned to the ballroom, Marcus was holding court, surrounded by admirers. He was magnetic, the sun in his own universe. Nina, a food critic with the instincts of a shark, watched him with narrowed eyes, already mapping out a counterattack. Isabel's lawyer, a powerhouse named Diana Croft, whom Nina had on speed dial, got to work the next day. Diana, Isabel began, her voice shaking, how much do you really know about my husband's finances? Diana's office overlooked the Chicago River. Publicly, I know he's valued at $80 million. I know he built one of the most successful restaurant groups in the country. I know his public image is pristine. What I also know is that men like Marcus Thorne don't build empires without burying a few bodies. Over the next few weeks, Diana and a team of forensic accountants began to excavate. Did Marcus ever talk to you about his long-term financial plans? Diana asked. Constantly, Isabel said. For the 6 months before we decided to get pregnant, it was all he talked about. Securing our future, building a legacy, he was obsessed with it. Diana leaned forward. What were his exact words? Isabel closed her eyes, the memory now tasting like acid. He said his greatest fear was building something so big only to have it fall apart. He said he was restructuring assets, creating trusts, spinning up new LLCs to protect our family. I thought it was for us, for the baby. Diana's expression was grim. Oh, he was protecting a future. It just wasn't yours. She pulled up a crisp, color-coded flowchart on the monitor. For the last 2 years, Marcus Thorne has been meticulously building a separate life and funneling money into it with your unwitting help. He hired wealth managers, he consulted with offshore tax attorneys, and he kept a detailed ledger. Diana clicked open the first file. We are prepared to present our findings, Miss Albright announced, her voice echoing slightly in the sterile, high-rise conference room. Julian's lead counsel, a man named Garrison, whose default expression was a condescending smirk, let out a short, dismissive laugh. We haven't had the opportunity to review any of this so-called evidence. Miss Albright offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes. You had 18 months to hide it, Mr. Garrison. I think we can spare an hour to review it now. The large monitor flickered to life, displaying a devastating timeline. 18 months of encrypted messages between Julian and Chloe, detailing not just their affair, but their plans for a future together. A complete business plan for a new lifestyle tech company with Chloe listed as the sole principal, funded by a series of shell corporations. Architectural renderings for a flagship restaurant in downtown Seattle, a property Elena knew had been offered to her 6 months prior. Recovered audio notes from a deep data dive in which Julian spoke to Chloe about their future and our real legacy. The room fell silent, the only sound the distant hum of city traffic. It was the profound quiet of a life imploding. Next came the financials. $68 million, systematically siphoned from Julian's personal investment funds into a labyrinth of untraceable accounts. The accounts all fed a parent company registered under Chloe Sterling's name. There were wire transfers to offshore banks, leases for luxury vehicles, and down payments on commercial properties. Julian's chief operating officer, a man named Marcus Thorne, had digitally signed off on every single transaction. He had helped Julian build a shadow financial empire, approving fabricated vendor invoices and manipulating R&D budgets to obscure the movement of cash. The COO of Nexus Dynamics had been Julian's co-conspirator for nearly 2 years. Garrison shot to his feet, his face turning a blotchy red. This is completely fabricated. It's slanderous. Miss Albright's tone was as sharp and cold as glass. It's been verified by 2 of the top forensic accounting firms in the country, Mr. Garrison. Their affidavits are attached. It was also of great interest to the Securities and Exchange Commission, which has opened a formal inquiry. Julian, sitting beside his lawyer, went ashen. He looked at Elena, his expression one of utter disbelief, not remorse. Then Miss Albright cued the audio file. A faint hiss from the speakers, and then Chloe's voice, confident and clear, filled the room from a conversation with a friend. He's planning to leave her after the baby's born. He said it's a cleaner break that way, better for the optics. He admitted he doesn't love her anymore, that the pregnancy was just an obligation he had to see through. He said, I'm the one who really understands his vision, his drive. I'm going to make sure that when the dust settles, Elena gets nothing. Because Elena is just a chapter he's ready to close. She was the safe choice, but I'm the right one. A long silence followed. Elena sat perfectly still, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. Her hands were clasped protectively over her belly. Julian, she said, her voice impossibly steady, I'm sorry. I am so sorry that I wasn't ambitious enough for you. I should have been more ruthless. I should have fought for your attention. Please accept my apology. And please, I'm begging you not to let Chloe take anything else that belongs to my child. The recording stopped. The silence in the room was a physical weight. Julian stood up. That's been edited. That's not what she meant. You've taken it out of context. Miss. Albright gave him a flat, unreadable stare. It was recovered from a cloud server your company pays for, dated April 3rd of this year. It has been authenticated by 3 certified audio forensic specialists, and Mr. Croft, and we have 17 more recordings just like it. Would you like me to play them all? Garrison didn't wait for his client to answer. He leaned in and spoke urgently in Julian's ear. An hour later, the preliminary settlement terms were on the table. Julian Croft would relinquish all claims to their shared assets and establish an ironclad trust fund for the child. Elena would receive a settlement giving her majority control over half his liquid wealth. Elena closed her eyes. There was no victory, no joy, just the quiet, steady rhythm of her own breathing, a feeling she hadn't known for months. Just breathing. 2 months of peace. That was what Elena got. 60 days that felt like learning to walk again after a brutal fall. She listed the cold, minimalist mansion overlooking Puget Sound for sale, a home filled with empty spaces, and Julian's cold aesthetic. She couldn't stand the emptiness. She bought a charming craftsman home in a quiet, sun-drenched part of Queen Anne, a house with a garden and rooms that felt like they could hold laughter. Isabella became her anchor. She'd arrive every morning with fresh pastries and a laptop, and they would sit in Elena's sunlit kitchen while Isabella mapped out the media strategy, fielding calls from reporters and crafting the narrative of a graceful woman rebuilding her world. Nexus Dynamics wasn't just a company, it was a Seattle institution, a tech giant with influence that ran deep through the city. Elena, however, wanted nothing to do with it. Her own legacy would be written on her own terms. Your husband didn't just write code, her friend Isabella said one morning over coffee. He built a fortress around himself. It's time you planted your own garden. Elena's first committee meeting for her new foundation was terrifying. It was held in a small, rented office with just 3 other people, herself, Isabella, and a skeptical-looking financial advisor. She could feel their hesitation, the unspoken question of whether the tech billionaire's quiet ex-wife had what it took to lead. She met their doubt without flinching. I don't know the first thing about venture capital, she admitted, her voice calm and measured. But I know food. I've spent 15 years in a world where value is measured by the story behind a dish. You learn to spot what's authentic. So this is my promise. I am going to listen, I am going to learn, and I am going to fund the chefs whose stories I believe in. I give you my word. I will not put a single cent into a project I don't understand with all my heart. The line was quiet for a moment. Then Lena, sitting beside her, started to applaud, a slow, deliberate clap of solidarity. Clara's first major acquisition was a fund to purchase the lost collection of a forgotten female painter from the 1930s, an artist ignored by the city's male-dominated art world. She made the call to the artist's elderly granddaughter herself, a woman in Oakland who started to cry softly into the phone. Our grant money was pulled last month. We thought her work would be lost forever. Clara simply said, "Let's bring her home." Lena called her that night. So how does it feel to be the new art world power broker of Pacific Heights? Terrifying. I made an old woman in Oakland cry because I told her she could afford to restore her grandmother's paintings. You see, Lena said, you're already better at this than Julian. He only makes his competitors cry. This is a significant upgrade. Clara let out a genuine, unburdened laugh that felt both alien and wonderful, like rediscovering a color she thought she'd never see again. She had her 32-week ultrasound with Lena holding her hand. As the technician moved the probe across her stomach, a perfect, tiny profile appeared on the monitor. A little girl, her little girl, her fingers, her toes, and a strong, steady heartbeat that filled the quiet room, the rhythm of a new life that was hers, and hers alone. Lena held the 3D ultrasound picture up to the window. She already has your determined chin, and look at that tiny clenched fist. That's my goddaughter coming into the world ready to stage a hostile takeover. Clara put the image in her wallet, placing it next to a faded photo of her immigrant grandparents standing in front of their first small shop. 3 generations of builders, one who had fought for a foothold, one who had learned to survive, and one who was just beginning to build her own legacy. The society blogs were surprisingly gentle, with one running a column titled, "The Curator Who Married a King and Gave Him a Conscience." Reading it in her small, quiet bed while eating gelato out of the container, Clara felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: true optimism. It was a dangerous asset. The reality of her situation arrived not with a crash, but with a quiet notification on a Thursday morning, just 2 weeks after that hopeful article. Clara was in Julian's Stark home office overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge, trying to access a shared financial server when she noticed an encrypted folder in the cloud storage she had never seen before. Julian had never given her the password. There was a problem. A rival developer, Marcus Thorne, had not been idle. He had spent the last few weeks quietly preparing a complete buyout of Julian's primary firm. Consumed by the frantic desperation of a man about to be exposed, Arthur Davenport knew a thorough review of his personal dealings would destroy him. He had a psychiatrist at a private Upper East Side clinic falsify a medical history suggesting Amelia's father, Julian, had a long-standing cognitive decline. He coerced 2 senior partners, men who owed their careers to Genevieve's father, to back his push for an emergency transfer of her family's voting shares. And he had carefully leaked calculated lies to a powerful financial journalist, raising doubts about Amelia's own emotional fitness. But the cruelest blow was discovering the plot's origin. While reviewing security protocols for their building, Amelia had casually checked the access logs for their private elevator. She saw Arthur's keycard used, and then, seconds later, Genevieve's, her own ruthless junior partner, at 2 in the morning. She clicked to listen to the audio recording. Their quiet conversation, a clear and concise plot to portray her as unstable and incompetent, echoed from the small speaker. The headline went live on a major financial news blog just an hour later. Pregnancy and pressure. Is the First Lady of Davenport Capital becoming a liability? The article was a masterpiece of character assassination, less about what it said and more about what it implied. Characterized as single, with no declared romantic ties, emotionally unstable, and prone to reckless behavior. The profile painted her as a woman adrift in grief and hormonal flux, completely unfit to steer a $100 billion tech empire. Chloe's phone vibrated. It was Isabel. She picked up, stunned into answering. "My dear." Isabel's voice was a slick, rehearsed performance of concern, one she had clearly honed over years of corporate maneuvering. "I just saw that awful blog post. I'm just sick with worry for you. A single woman on the verge of motherhood trying to manage a company of that scale. It's an impossible burden. Julian would have only wanted what was safest for the child." Chloe ended the call, a cold fury making her tremble. Isabel immediately called back. Chloe let it ring, but the insinuation had already taken root. The emergency board meeting was a firing squad. Julian presented his argument with the polished empathy of a seasoned dealmaker, pointing to her emotional unpredictability, the physical demands of her pregnancy, and her supposed lack of business experience. He framed it all as profound, unwavering concern. "We are not attempting to oust Chloe," he stated smoothly. "We are merely proposing a period of rest and recuperation to safeguard the company's assets during this vulnerable time." The vote was 6-4 against her. 2 security guards she'd traded coffee with for years walked her out of the Silicon Valley headquarters. She found herself on the pavement, 8 months pregnant, clutching a single box of her desk belongings, a small, custom-made circuit board charm. A gift from her father fell from the box, its delicate wiring snapping on the concrete. She gazed at the broken piece on the ground, the legacy it symbolized now fractured. Self-driving cars whizzed by on the street, the hum of the valley a loud, indifferent drone. Her phone vibrated. A text from a private number said, "Check your work email." It was a message from Isabel's legal team, a formal proposal. Isabel would take over as interim CEO of the tech firm. Chloe would be given a monthly allowance of $50,000 and the use of a condo in San Jose. In return, she would forfeit all claims to her stock options and sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement. $50,000 a month. It was a joke. It was a rounding error. It was the lint from the pockets of an empire she had built from the ground up. At the end of the email, in a minuscule font, "This offer will expire in 72 hours. Isabel was giving her 3 days to sign away her entire identity. That night, Chloe sat in her friend Maya's tiny spare room, the city lights feeling a world away. It was all gone. The company, her office, the future she had envisioned for her son. Her phone rang. The screen lit up with Julian's name. She should have shattered it against the plasterboard wall. But at 3 in the morning, 8 months pregnant, sleeping on a fold-out bed with her life in shambles, you don't always do the logical thing. "Chloe?" His voice was uncertain, strained, a pathetic version of the visionary she thought she was marrying. "I know what Isabel did. I know her whole scheme. Chloe, I am so sorry. She promised me a way out. $200,000 and a clean slate. I was weak. I was a fool. I want to make this right. I'll go to the investors. I will tell them everything." Chloe squeezed her eyes shut. She wanted to believe him. Every betrayed, broken part of her soul cried out to believe that someone, anyone, was telling her the truth. "Meet me," Julian begged. "I will show you everything, that little coffee shop in Palo Alto where we sketched out our first algorithm, tomorrow at noon." She said yes. It was a disastrous mistake. When Chloe got to the coffee shop the next day, the tech bloggers were already circling. At least 8 of them with cameras, and a few with live streaming setups. Julian was standing near the door, his hands jammed into his pockets. The moment he saw her, his look of rehearsed anguish confirmed everything. He had betrayed her, yet again. The headlines that evening were ruthless. Tech founder's pregnant fiancée in public meltdown amidst corporate coup, a bid for sympathy or a devious ploy. Within hours, Isabel's lawyers had submitted a new filing. The photos, they claimed, were undeniable proof that Chloe and Julian were colluding all along in a brazen scheme to manipulate stock prices before the IPO. Chloe sat in Maya's apartment by herself that night. Maya had a late shift. The only noises were the buzz of the old mini-fridge and the city's distant hum. She picked up the broken circuit board charm from her bedside table, its intricate design now a web of cracks. "You're my entire universe." It was what Marcus always murmured to her before leaving for his architecture firm. "Our entire universe," Clara would whisper back, her hand resting on the curve of her belly. But recently his universe seemed to be expanding, leaving her alone in their quiet, modern Los Angeles home. And then, the baby would kick, a firm, reassuring thump, a tiny foot pressing against her ribs with a strength that felt like a secret promise. "It's just us," the kick seemed to communicate. "It's just us, Mom, and we are enough." Marcus's video call came through at 10 that evening, his face looking worn but smiling from his studio. He was showing her the final designs for a client's beach house, but as he shared his screen, a notification from a messaging app popped up in the corner for a split second. A message from Anya, his new intern. "Can't wait for the Malibu trip. Last night was incredible." He closed it in a heartbeat, but the words were seared into Clara's memory. She felt the air leave her lungs. The baby kicked again, but this time it was not a promise. It was a warning siren. When she came to the next morning, the sorrow had hardened into something sharp, frigid, and decisive. Resolve. "Show me everything," she said to the silent room. She logged into their shared cloud storage. Marcus didn't have an estate plan. He had an escape plan. She didn't need a private detective to uncover it. The first piece of the puzzle was the one everyone knew about, the design symposium in Malibu he'd mentioned weeks ago. That was the official story. That was the alibi. The alibi for what? For this. For a 5-night reservation at the most exclusive oceanfront bungalow. For 2 first-class, non-refundable plane tickets. She checked the passenger information. The second ticket was not for a business partner. It was for Anya. Clara stared at the screen. A thick, cold knot of fear tightening in her stomach. The trip had one clear purpose. A romantic escape for 2, a celebration of his new relationship, paid for with the earnings of the life he was abandoning. It was the hubris that gave him away, you see. That was the flaw. If the affair had been a simple, momentary lapse, concealed with guilt, the evidence might have stayed hidden. But Marcus's scheme had specific patterns. Extravagant charges on a secret credit card, a separate folder for travel documents, a detailed calendar of their deception. He checked every single box. He essentially created a roadmap to his own exposure. The coffee went cold in Clara's cup. She hadn't even realized she was holding it. "And the beach house?" she whispered. Clara, for the first time in 9 months, felt a rush of adrenaline that was not about her pregnancy. His face when he'd shown her the designs had been glowing with an artist's pride, but it was not for a client. She found the project folder on their shared server. It contained every blueprint he had worked on for the past 6 months. Encrypted messages, wire transfers, a deed for a property in Malibu. It was undeniable proof, written in Julian's own precise script, that he had been grooming Ava and her tech startup since 2022, using their shared capital as his personal slush fund. "He was planning," Clara breathed, the words catching in her throat. "He was planning his exit, with my inheritance, with our future." He had constructed a perfect illusion, one that could only be undone by a key he himself had forged. His meticulous, arrogant need to document his conquests. Clara rested her palms on the cool granite of his office desk. Julian had designed the system so that every step he took toward his new life created an immutable record of his betrayal. Every 5-star dinner charged to a ghost account, every weekend getaway logged as a networking expense, every wire transfer to her offshore account, it all became another entry in his journal of deceit. He had been unwittingly building the foundation for her divorce settlement for years. Clara picked up the heavy, leather-bound ledger she'd found in the back of his personal safe. The cover was embossed with his personal motto, a quote from a Stoic philosopher. "The obstacle is the way." He expected me to be the obstacle, she thought, a low, dangerous anger simmering within her. Clara closed the ledger with a soft thud. He expected me to just disappear. Anyone can seem composed when their life is a fairy tale. He never counted on me finding the strength to burn his kingdom down when mine was turning to ash. And she would. Every fiber of her being screamed it. Clara stood and saw her own determined face reflected in the dark, polished wood of the desk. How much time did she have before their baby moon? It was tomorrow. They had reservations for a private villa in Napa at 8 p.m. Does Ava know that I know? Not a chance. Clara walked to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the San Francisco Bay, taking a long, calming breath. "Cancel our Napa reservation for tomorrow evening," she said to the home's integrated AI. As the confirmation chimed, a slow, predatory smile touched her lips. "And book a private room at Perbaco. Tomorrow night, 9 o'clock, a table for 3. What's the occasion?" "I'm about to liquidate my husband's most personal venture." The sprawling Pacific Heights mansion Julian had bought was meant to be their forever home. Tonight, the lights of the Golden Gate Bridge glittered in the distance like a diamond necklace. Clara, 7 months pregnant, was supposed to be finalizing the designs for their baby's room. Instead, she was staring at the ledger Julian kept hidden in his safe. He called it his Angel Investments book. Her blood ran cold as she turned a page. Inside were not stock tips, but receipts from a jeweler in Carmel for a custom-made tennis bracelet, a string of flawless emeralds and diamonds, elegant and stunning. And definitely not the one he'd given her for their anniversary. The jeweler's notes were sickeningly familiar, referencing an inside joke about winning at Pebble Beach, a tournament Julian had claimed he attended with clients. A wave of nausea hit her as she read further. It wasn't just jewelry. It was a perfectly chronicled history of a 2-year affair. Invoices for a permanent suite at the Post Ranch Inn, registered to a shell corporation. First-class flight confirmations for 2 to Lake Como, to Tokyo, to St. Bart's, all during times he was supposedly on fundraising roadshows in Boston. And then the descriptions, pages detailing his trysts with Ava Chen, the brilliant, ruthless founder of a company his firm had backed. Ava laughing in a private jet, the Alps below them. Ava wearing his university sweatshirt on the balcony of a suite overlooking the ocean. Every line was a betrayal, revealing not a momentary lapse in judgment, but a calculated parallel life. He wasn't just cheating. He was building an empire with another woman, financed by the life they had supposedly built together. The $97 million he'd invested in her company felt insignificant next to the price of 2 stolen years. When Julian walked in just after 1 a.m., he was ecstatic, smelling of gin and a sharp floral perfume she didn't recognize. He kissed her forehead, completely unaware, rambling about a merger he had just orchestrated. Clara was waiting for him in his study, the ledger lying open on the ottoman between them, illuminated by a single desk lamp. His triumphant smile vanished. The denial was instant and reflexive. "It's not what you think, Clara. You're pregnant, you're being overly emotional." But she just silently pointed to a line item on the page. His voice was a bare whisper. "The one in Monaco last spring, when I was at home with that terrible flu carrying your daughter? Or the one where you bought her an emerald bracelet that cost more than our first home?" His face went pale, a mask of stone. You broke into my private safe?" It was an accusation, not an apology. And in that cold, empty question, she knew that their marriage was utterly and completely finished. "This wasn't a bad investment, Julian," she said, her voice a low, steady hum that defied the shaking of her hands. "This was a hostile takeover. You built a whole other life on my assets." The Wall Street titan finally crumbled, his usual boardroom bravado melting into a desperate plea. He claimed the affair was just a dalliance, a meaningless diversification, that he loved her and their future. But his words were like junk bonds, worthless promises from a company that was already bankrupt. She watched the man who could move markets with a single call come completely undone. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood, a hand resting on her pregnant stomach, and said, "I want your exit strategy executed immediately." The finality in her voice was more cutting than any market crash. The heavy oak doors of their Park Avenue penthouse closed behind him, the click echoing in the suddenly cavernous silence. There were no flashing cameras, no public scandal, just the quiet, brutal liquidation of a marriage exposed by a single, ostentatious diamond necklace. As the doorman escorted him out, Julian paused. He glanced up at the limestone facade of the building, his personal monument to success. He knew he wasn't just losing an apartment, he was losing the only portfolio that had ever held real value. He had built a financial empire, but he had leveraged its heart and soul into oblivion. Claire had the locks changed by morning. His 32 calls went to voicemail. The apology bouquet was rejected at the front desk. Her best friend Chloe showed up with an overnight bag and a look that could scare a bear market. In a drawer Julian had emptied, Chloe found the jeweler's preliminary sketch. On the back, in Sloane's loopy script, it read, "He said a queen deserves a crown." "I guess some kingdoms are just meant to be conquered." Claire looked at it, her expression unreadable. "Love isn't a stock, Chloe," she said, tearing the sketch into clean halves. "You can't just short sell someone's heart and expect to get rich." The evidence was all on Sloane's Instagram feed. Claire scrolled through every post, every story highlight, 3 years of deception, geotagged and time-stamped. She stared at each photo, forcing herself to witness the full scale of the fraud. It was a painful audit, stripping away the illusion of the man she thought she had married. She mourned the future that was now just a bad projection, tears falling until she felt only a stark, empty calm. She screenshotted the entire account onto a secure cloud server, naming the folder Due Diligence. Her mother's portrait, a painting from her days as an art student, seemed to watch from across the room, a silent testament to a resilience she was just now discovering. It was during a conference call with her divorce attorney while calmly listing Julian's offshore accounts that the first contraction hit. "Chloe," she said, her voice strained but controlled, "I think the market's about to open." Chloe navigated midtown traffic like a seasoned pro, her Tesla humming through a symphony of horns. "I saw this on a reality show once," Chloe shouted, narrowly missing a taxi. "I think you're supposed to breathe into a paper bag, which we don't have." Claire focused on her breathing. "Just get me to Lenox Hill, Chloe." Her father, a retired federal judge, was already on the phone with the head of obstetrics, his calm, authoritative voice ensuring their top doctor was waiting. "Chloe, the light was red," he boomed through the car's speaker system. "It was more of a suggestion," she yelled back. Oliver James Peterson was born at 10:17 p.m., weighing a solid 8 pounds 2 ounces. He had Claire's dark, wavy hair and a focused, steady gaze that reminded her of her own father. As Claire held him, the chaos of the last month receded. The lights of the Manhattan skyline outside her window seemed softer, more welcoming. Her father stood at the door, his eyes bright with emotion, witnessing the start of a new dynasty. Chloe was passed out on the recliner, her phone having slipped from her grasp. On the bedside table, beside a glass of water, was a small silver locket that had belonged to Claire's mother. Engraved on the back were her words: "True value is not listed on any exchange." Claire gazed down at her son, so new and whole, blissfully unaware of the fortune held in his trust or the emotional war that had preceded his birth. "Your father was a genius with numbers," she whispered, gently tracing the line of his jaw, "but he never understood the metrics of the heart. And your mother," she smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached her eyes for the first time in ages, "was an art expert who fell for a very convincing forgery." Oliver let out a tiny, perfect yawn. "But you," she whispered, placing a soft kiss on his forehead, "you, my sweet boy, are the masterpiece." She smiled not for the lawyers, or the impending settlement, or the financial empire she would now systematically take apart. She smiled because her son was here, and for the first time she felt she was building something real, something that was truly priceless, because the truth was about to be served, the way her grandmother always said it would be, and because for the first time in years, Olivia felt like the main character in her own story. Outside the restaurant window, the city of New York glittered, its buildings and bridges and people all moving with relentless purpose. The Perfect Financier brand was a facade. The prospectus for their perfect life was in ashes, and somewhere, in whatever sleek, glass-walled office arrogant and unfaithful men go, Julian was finally exposed. His wife was finally free. This is a story about the high price of a lie and the immeasurable value of the truth. It is about the people who build their foundations on rock and the empty lives of those who build theirs for an audience. If you have ever been manipulated, underestimated, or made to feel like a guest in your own home, this story was written for you. If you are ready, stay with me. This is going to change how you see those picture-perfect couples you scroll past every day. And if this story speaks to you, do me one small favor. Hit that follow button, drop a comment telling me what city you're from, and share this with one person who needs to be reminded of their own power today. Because stories like this don't just entertain, they remind us of the steel in our own spines. This narrative was carefully crafted, researched, and produced by our team to deliver compelling stories with lessons that matter. Every word was chosen with purpose because we believe that stories with meaning are more essential than ever. Thank you for listening, and thank you for being a vital part of our community.